Okay, so we do not have much of this chapter left, so we'll finish it and be done for the day because we won't have quite enough time to actually do the review. So, rest of the chapter today, review Wednesday, and then the test will be next week. So I'd rather just put it off another day than not give us a proper review time. Okay. If those of you that turned your papers in, I do have those done. I'm still working on the online ones. So if you physically handed your paper to me, they're here. You can grab those. Now or on the way out, whatever you want to do, you can keep them. I've got should have all the grades recorded. Yeah. Any questions before we start? Okay. So we ended here with Roosevelt's technical first term. Again, his term when he completed the last 3 years of McKinley's term after McKinley got shot did not technically count as his first term, so he could run 2 more times if he wanted to. So again, 1904, he ran for the president, and he completely destroyed Judge Alton Parker. He did more preservation, conservation, fighting against various business corruption, etc. We also have the bit of reform done by Congress, which is when The Jungle was written. Middle, the canned meat wouldn't kill people as often anymore. And also the meatpacking plants actually had some level of federal oversight as opposed to just, good luck. Then also the Pure Food and Drug Act, where you had to properly label what was in your food and medicine, because before you just did whatever. I don't remember if I mentioned you guys or to my other class, but an example of the regulations that this sort of thing fixes, that let's just say certain individuals in politics today are trying to get repealed, were things that allowed, say, milk companies, when their milk spoiled before they sent it out, they just put sawdust in it, and that would reduce the smell for one. And you also wouldn't be able to really tell if it was chunky because it was going bad or because there was sawdust in it. And that was just fine because there were no regulations, or at least there were far fewer regulations back then. And this is the sort of thing that fixed that. And that's the sort of regulation that when you hear politicians say, we're going to get rid of these regulations and let businesses make more money, this is the sort of stuff they're talking about getting rid of. Just FYI. Regulations do cost more money, but it makes it so that it's safer for everyone else, because it's not like if they were to take these regulations away and businesses were to suddenly make more money, the people working would make any more money. It's all going to go to the top, and those billionaires need their 6th mega yacht. Anyway, we mentioned Coca-Cola last time. Oh wait, yeah, the cocaine toothache drops, again, my favorite image. And the Coca-Cola thing, which again, to clarify, especially for my online students who may not have been listening last time, no, they did not just cut or create refined cocaine and just dump the powder into the barrels while the Coca-Cola was being made. But it was, the original formula was made from the plant that cocaine is made from, the coca plant. And this is less This is less an instance of the whole, you got to make sure that you say what's in it. Because people were like, oh yeah, this got this plant in it. This was back when people were doing opium just because that was the norm. So the gradual phasing out of this was the understanding of what the coca plant had in it. So that's somewhat related. I do have to get a little pedantic there. So, 1908 came, and Roosevelt decided that he wasn't going to run for another term because, again, he technically could have. That would have been his second term as president rather than, like I said just a minute ago, taking over for McKinley. But he decided that he was done. He was bored now, and he was going to back William Howard Taft as his hand-picked successor. Taft had been, let's see, the book goes into a bit more detail about Taft's background. Morning. Let's see. Oh, I missed that again, but it's okay. And yeah. All right. So, he was a federal judge, Solicitor General of the United States, whatever that means, Governor of the Philippines, which we will talk about later, and Secretary of War. So, it wasn't that Taft was just some dude that Roosevelt knew and decided he'll make a good president because I know the guy. He actually had a decent background. And he whipped William Jennings Bryan because A, he was backed by Roosevelt, and B, William Jennings Bryan has not had good luck. If you recall, a few chapters ago, we talked about the election between Bryan and McKinley, and one of the little political cartoons, I think it was from Puck, was like everything that Bryan says makes McKinley win more. So yeah, it wasn't close. So while Taft certainly had the credentials, he didn't have nearly the charisma that Roosevelt had. And he also was weak in terms of leadership. He wasn't really able to stand up to opposition. In 1909, there was a session of Congress that was supposed to support lower tariffs. I wrote oppression. That's supposed to be opposition. This was probably one of my 2 a.m. It's on the last page. Mm-hmm. It was probably one of my 2 a.m. Note making. And anyway, at the end of all of that, he ended up signing the Payne-Aldrich tariff into law, which increased tariffs, which were the opposite of what progressives were supposed to be standing for. Like, their whole thing was, we're lowering tariffs, so, it's lower prices for the consumer. Taft also fired Pinchot for criticizing his Secretary of Interior to return by bleh. He fired Pinchot, who had criticized Taft's Secretary of the Interior for returning restricted Alaskan coal mines to private miners. And if you're not familiar with how that works, if there's a private mine, there's no regulation, or very little regulation. And if you're going to have private coal mines out in the middle of Alaska, that's not going to be great for the environment. Now, granted, again, Taft isn't really like in the top 5 worst presidents, but he's up there. But he wasn't that bad. He wasn't as bad as he could have been. But compared to Roosevelt, he was a definite downgrade. He did do a lot for conservation, but Roosevelt was upset that he would dismiss Pinchot for pretty petty reasons. So Roosevelt, who had been off on safari in Africa, because of course, and then also on a speaking tour in Europe because the Europeans were really, really interested in this Roosevelt guy. So he went through Europe and did a speaking tour and really created uh, the American mindset for Europeans for quite some time. Um, if you ever see like a European movie, especially an older European movie, and there's like a character that's either American or just supposed to be American, and they're always sort of portrayed as like a cowboy, not literally a cowboy, sometimes literally a cowboy. Shouldn't, sometimes literally a cowboy, but like they've got this cowboy bearing to them. That's because of Roosevelt. That's how a lot of Europeans just saw America. And then like in World War I and World War II, he like came in with this huge military, and I'm not going to say saved the day, but we helped, um, at least until the Cold War, and we were like starting wars just to facilitate our own political means. Um, they liked us pretty good. Anyway, so he attacked Taft for filing antitrust legislation against U.S. Steel for a deal that Roosevelt had agreed to in 1907. To expand on that a little bit, as we mentioned previously, while Roosevelt is known as the trust buster, which we have there, Roosevelt did differentiate between what he saw as good and bad trusts. Those that were good he saw as being beneficial to the economy, so they were fine, they could exist. And specifically, the deal that U.S. Steel had made with Roosevelt's administration, obviously under Roosevelt's under Roosevelt's knowledge, he knew what was going on. And then Taft comes along and files a suit against that very agreement. It just feels, it makes the presidency feel unstable. Because if you can make an agreement with one president and then the next president tries to sue you for that agreement, and these guys were of the same party. I mean, like we said, Roosevelt handpicked Taft. It's not like they were opposition, so it was causing issues. Anyway, here's Taft, by the way, if you didn't know what Taft looks like. He's sort of a walrus-looking fella. I'm trying to remember, I think he might have been the one that got stuck in the bathtub in the White House because he was very large. Like he couldn't get out of the bathtub because he was literally physically stuck. Harper's Weekly. You've got Taft here in Roosevelt's clothes. Again, Roosevelt wasn't a big guy, and Taft very much was, so they're really expanding on that here. He says he will avoid the newspapers. Don't you think you'd better read them? And that this is just a daily paper going over basically a bunch of what we've already talked about. These issues that were plaguing Taft's administration. And also you've got Wilson here. Wilson was, I believe, Secretary of State. And, spoiler for those of you that aren't familiar at all with this era of history, Wilson is the next president. So he was there doing a lot of stuff already. Again, we've got, Taft supposedly trying to follow Roosevelt's footsteps, but going the opposite direction. And you've got all these things that we've already talked about, the tariffs and the Aldrich tariff, the Pinchot case, etc. And then there's this political cartoon of Roosevelt coming back from safari, which again, he'd been to Europe first, but don't worry about that. And apparently there was this popular outcry, I should say, among those who knew that Roosevelt was going to cause them trouble. So apparently, reading down here at the bottom, a scientist who has investigated the fevers of Africa says that Roosevelt or any member of his party may be infected by the sleeping sickness germ. That's like, it's not malaria. I think it might be yellow fever. It's one of the many tropical diseases from Africa that was this big scary thing in the late 1800s, early 1900s. He says the germ may not develop until after their return to the United States, and warns warns the authorities that they should quarantine the hunters, which is to say, any excuse to keep Roosevelt from running his mouth and turning the public opinion against Taft. Not that there wasn't already a lot of public opinion against Taft. So you've got here, we must run no risk. Now it says these are the trusts because, again, there was this, specifically John D. Rockefeller, because there was this popular idea that Roosevelt was the trust buster. But Taft had been breaking up more trust than Roosevelt did, but we won't worry about that part. Aldrich, which that was the tariff, says by all means keep him out. Taft here has the funniest line. Sleeping sickness is a terrible thing. I know, I've had it for a year, which is to say he's been asleep at the wheel and not been doing anything as president except screwing it up. So, yeah, that sort of joke has been a thing for at least 100 years now. Also, you may recall the various images we had of, was it Cleveland? No. I know there was Johnson, and there was also where like they were always depicted as like these court jesters, but also, it was Cleveland with like the marionettes. This was the common depiction of Taft for some reason. It's this large man in an ill-fitting maid outfit. Now, granted, this is the representation of, as you can see, the White House there is where the yarn is coming from. The mess he's made of the administration, and Roosevelt's there creepily looking in the window. All right. So, 1912 came, and it was time for another election, and Roosevelt felt like he needed to take the reins from Taft and heal the rift he had created, because there were a lot of Republicans who were turning against the party due to the missteps Taft was making. However, despite Taft being quite unpopular, he still held all the party machinery, which is to say the purse strings of the Republican Party. So in the first ballot, which is what today we would just call the primary election, Taft won. Taft beat out Roosevelt in the primary election and became the candidate for the Republican Party. So Roosevelt, who was never one to quit while he was ahead, stated he felt as fit as a bull moose and created the Progressive Party. The quote there is going to be important in just a moment. So by creating a new party specifically about progressivism, yeah, sorry, I don't know where the tissues went. He accepted this idea of new nationalism. The government should work for social justice and the good of the people. So this Bull Moose Party, which was the nickname for it, because again, it was Roosevelt's party, and that statement of his stuck. Advocated income and inheritance taxes, an 8-hour workday, abolition of child labor, workers' compensation, fewer restrictions on labor unions, women's suffrage, the latter of which got women like Jane Addams working with the Progressive Party. Meanwhile, the Democrats had Woodrow Wilson, who, obviously seeing Roosevelt as the stronger opponent, built his platform around opposing this new nationalism in the New Freedom platform. He was born in Virginia. He saw the government needing to be more limited than what Roosevelt was using it for. Healthy competition between businesses, but rejected women's suffrage and the abolition of child labor because, children yearn for the factories, I guess. Also, there was actually a relatively strong fourth party candidate in Eugene V. Debs. Remember him from the Homestead strike? Well, he's back, and he is running the Socialist Party, which was definitely the biggest blip it ever had before, World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, which completely poisoned the idea here. Anyway, all that being said, Wilson won the presidency with 43% of the popular vote because Roosevelt and Taft had split the Republican vote because some people were just going to vote straight Republican and others were going to vote for Roosevelt. Unfortunately, since they were both running for very similar things, they just split the vote entirely and neither won. And I say unfortunately because I am biased towards this guy. I mean, look at him. There's Roosevelt giving a speech behind a big old moose head. Yeah. Now, I don't think it would have been necessarily better if he had backed down and let Taft run again, and Taft would have won, because Taft would not have done well with World War I don't believe. I don't know what he would have done differently from Wilson, but Wilson was actually a fairly decent president. We'll go into a little bit more about how he was a horrible person, but he was a decent president. I've got this image here of the Progressive Wilderness Party, which has a website. I don't know if it still exists because this was from I don't know, 2012 when I found it. So no telling how old it was when I found it. But hey, maybe it still exists. Here he is again, giving a speech. As I said, he wasn't an especially tall man. He was certainly larger. He was broad. He played football and whatnot at Harvard. But he wasn't like a really tall, imposing man. He just had that presence that has kept him in the public eye for, again, like literally 100 years at this point. Here is Wilson throwing out the first pitch at, I don't know, some baseball game. I'm sure there's some specific hyper-focused group of historians who could tell you exactly what baseball game that was, but I'm not one of them. And there he is giving a speech. So let's talk, oh, sorry, we're not there yet. Sorry, Debs, forgot about you for a moment. So there's socialist candidates, Eugene V. Debs and Emil Seidel, the vice president. Obviously, they came in fourth, but it was more of a fourth party than we certainly have today. As I've said before, when you guys do finally go to vote for the first time, and especially when it's like a major election, you have the two parties that you've heard about for the last 2 years at that point because, I hate election cycles. But there's like 6 other candidates, most of which you'd never heard of. Like the Green Party, you may have heard the name if you watch the news enough, but you never you never see them on debate stages or anything. So that's kind of where these guys were. They were a little above that at least. So, Wilson. Wilson disagreed with Roosevelt on the extent of the federal government's involvement in everyday life. However, he did agree with, I will talk today. He did agree with Roosevelt that the president should still be a strong, active leader, and so in the course of the first year, very quickly began to get his reforms underway in Washington. Tariff reduction, which is weird because that was like one of the major things that the progressives were about, and Taft is not that, but tariff reduction was one of the top ones with the Underwood Act of 1913. Also, this created a graduated income tax, which again was a populist agenda item, which in turn was a progressive agenda item. They ratified the 16th Amendment in 1913 that allowed for this income tax, which had previously been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, but that it's been like 150 years at this point. So this income tax was necessary to keep money in the federal government because the tariffs were how the government had made money before. But again, you produce tariffs, you're going to reduce prices across the board and increase competition globally. That said, only incomes over $4,000 a year were subject to this law, and in 1912, 90% of Americans didn't make that. And it's not that 90% of Americans were like destitute, but 90%, I mean, $4,000 back then was pretty decent. So the 10% over that were only taxed from 1 to 6% on incomes of $500,000 or more. So again, they had to be very rich to be taxed at all, and the tax rates were real low compared to today. But then they had to start taxing everybody because the rich assholes started like finding ways, loopholes around this with offshore accounts and stuff. And now they're just paid by the government because what is it? I know specifically EA, but I keep up with that market more than like regular stuff. But like they get tax breaks to such an extent they basically get like a tax rebate while themselves not paying any tax. So they're just getting paid by the government to exist, and they're making billions of dollars a year. So whatever, I don't know anything. However, while Wilson had gotten done most of what he had promised in his campaign by the second year, so halfway through his term, during the midterms, the Republicans resurged in Congress, which created greater opposition. And rather than just stonewalling, Wilson listened to the opposition and was more progressive in his politics. So let's see, we have the Adamson Act that provided overtime pay. Keaton-Owen Act borrowed child labor. So again, that was a thing that he had said was not a big deal. But now he was agreeing to not have child labor anymore. Workmen's Compensation Act provided insurance in case of injury, which again wasn't a thing yet. And these are all like, I mean, today they're pretty obvious, even though again, like some states are trying to get rid of them. And he wasn't the progressive candidate. Now, that said, let me give you why I say Wilson was a terrible president. Terrible person, sorry. Decent president, terrible person. So, the one example that I know for sure, because otherwise I'd have to do more research, and I don't feel like doing more research on Wilson of all people, was that at this time, it was pretty common for a president to screen like the big movies of the day at the White House, especially those that they personally supported. And this would cause the film in question to get a big boost in popularity, et cetera, et cetera. So the film that Wilson screened at the White House was Birth of a Nation. Now, if you're not familiar with what that is, because the name is a bit innocuous unless you know what it is, in which case Birth of a Nation makes you shiver. Birth of a Nation was a propaganda film by the Ku Klux Klan. It specifically retold the events of the founding of the nation as well as specifically the end of the Civil War, but through a lens of scary black men need to be murdered by courageous white men on horseback. And I mean that's the real broad strokes. It's like similar to what we saw with the case with the boxer, where it was like these black men are after our white women. Ugh. We gotta do crimes against humanity against them. And Wilson's response to this, because it was a pretty, I mean, they didn't really hide the brutality of it in the film either. It wasn't a documentary or anything. It was, again, it was just a movie, but they portrayed a lot of the brutality. His comment was, the most terrible thing about this film is that it is so true. So he not only showed a Ku Klux Klan propaganda film that retold American history through the lens of the Klan, but agreed with it and endorsed it, because those were his personal feelings and convictions. So yeah, thanks, Wilson. This is an image from the book with Wilson and Taft at Wilson's inauguration. On Inauguration Day. Taft clearly was not too displeased with no longer being in office. The book specifically says here, not considered a jovial man, Wilson is seen here enjoying himself as he takes office. So yeah, Wilson was pretty glum most of the time. He wasn't an especially happy guy. And we're going to see a lot of that going forward, because again, World War I's about to happen. Now that said, again, politics-wise, he wasn't that bad. Here we have him talking about the progressives, which again are his opponents politically. He says, all the progressive ask or desire is permission, in an era when development, evolution is the scientific word, to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. All they ask is recognition of the fact that a nation is a living thing and not a machine. Which is to say, he spoke of his opponents pretty fairly. Like, hey, they see that the nation has the Constitution, especially. You can't go back to 1783 and be like, okay, we got to read the Constitution as is, and nothing can change, because that was written in 1783. We still had slavery, for one. I don't think Wilson was too much against that, clearly, but that over time, humanity itself is going to change, and therefore so will the nation that people build, and therefore these founding documents, while they're still important for the foundation, have to be interpreted in a way that fits the modern day. We can't just, because like if we did some of the nitpicky stuff from like this late 1700s, we would be able to tie our mules off at the post office. That was literally a law at one point. So yeah. Anyway, here we are. Here is a response to the 1 to 6% income tax on the top 10% richest people in America. The slave of liberty is this income tax. Yeah. Oh, bad boy, they're hurting so bad. Meanwhile, we have Wilson delivering the goods. You've got the first year, postmarker? Yeah. This is, the mile markers on the interstate? That's what they used to look like this. They were little, like, stone obelisks, because you were on a cart, not in a car going 80 miles an hour. So there were these more ornate mile markers, and this is the mile marker, quote, of his first year. You've got trust regulation, currency reform, tariff revision, et cetera, et cetera. Right, so, I said we're going to have a short class. So, with the work of the progressives, Americans began to expect more from the government. Food and medicine were safer, children could go to school rather than being forced to work, women laborers were not exploited as much. That still takes a while to really sort out. Because in Wilson's inauguration, women still couldn't vote. Like, again, it wasn't until 1919, and Wilson's already gone by then. Political officials had to respond to constituents, because that's what the direct election thing was about. That seems like, it's just another political thing. But if politicians are being directly elected by their constituents, to again just use this as an example, the residents of South Carolina, or I guess each district, and they start doing a poor job, and enough people vote against them, they no longer have a job. Back then, that didn't. Once they were in office, they were completely shielded from public scrutiny. Now, though, they had to listen to their people, who had the environmentalists. The government was working to better preserve and conserve land efficiently. Again, that's the parks as well as using the land in a way that wasn't seen as wasteful. And while progressivism did challenge laissez-faire, individualism and competition were still seen as good. They just wanted to balance individualism with social justice and self-control, because not that we would know anything about this in today's world, today's utopian world, but when you let crony capitalists run unimpeded, they will just push as close to the slavery line as they can. That's why you need the regulations. They will get rid of as many of the safety things as they can, lower wages as much as possible, skyrocket the hours. I heard some asshole, actually, I'm not going to be facetious with this. Elon Musk wanted to create a company town. And if you're not familiar with what a company town is, this was more of a 1800s thing. This is where the entire town was run by, if you can tell from the name, a company, because everyone in that town worked for whatever that company was. Again, it was usually like Western, like mining and stuff. And the thing about that is the town, that means that the company controls that entire town. The price of food, the price of living anywhere in that town, any taxes, any laws run by that town. And sometimes it was even worse. You wouldn't get paid money. You would get paid, what was it, like company bonds or whatever. Basically, you'd be given this fake monopoly money that you could only spend at the company store in that town. That's what a company town means. And that's what the richest man in the world wants to do. So, yeah. Anyway, seems like a great idea, guys. Finally, while progressives had overall similar ideas, they were not monolithic in their movement. They approached this progression in different ways. Some were from middle class, some were lower class. They would gain the support of the rich and poor depending on what the issue was. Obviously, conservatives tended to fight against this change, but as we saw again with Wilson, who was a conservative candidate, by 1920, these reforms had gone through and changed the nation without any kind of violent revolution. So, yeah, the progressive era made its mark. It didn't go perhaps as far as some of the progressive leaders would have wanted, and as I've said several times, there's certainly been moves to undo that. If you ever hear people talking bad about the EPA, just remember that video I showed, or the picture I showed you of the river on fire. Yeah, that's the sort of thing they want to get rid of. Anyway, yeah, that's chapter 19. If the study guide isn't already on Blackboard, which I think I put it up on Blackboard on Thursday, I'll put it up, and then we'll do the review on Wednesday and be ready for the test next week. And again, for those of you that turned your papers in online, which of course includes all you online students, I'm working on that. I apologize. But I'm getting there. All right, let's end the stream, and I will see y'all on Wednesday.